Good morning, Kosha. Thanks so much for making time for this conversation and really looking forward to it. Normally, I ask people to introduce themselves with a whole life story, but I feel like we could get to that later. And also, many people already know you because we've talked before. I would just love to take this call from your wealth of experience of having worked with Jen for so long now, first in general with the Ecovillage movement, and in recent years really helping to lead this diverse group of people working in a very horizontal way into its future for quite some time now, and you're just about to step out of that. So I think it would be wonderful to have you recount a little bit from your perspective, also how you connected to it first, the story of the Global Ecovillage Network, because I know something about it, but many people might not.
Thanks, Daniel. Yeah, it's lovely to be here with you for the series first. I'm so with you that this is the age where we need to shift from degenerative to regenerative cultures, and lovely to bring that piece of the puzzle, the mini piece that is my own personal contribution, my own life. But then the bigger, slightly bigger piece of the puzzle there is also the contribution of the Global Ecovillage Network, which I just feel so joyful and honored to have been a part of. And for some reason, it intertwined quite early in my life. So it's the impulse to move away from individual protest against social injustice and understanding that actually we need to come together. I think also, as you know, I grew up in South Africa, and then I started being an activist against the apartheid system quite early on. And that was quite a lonely place to be in life. So I think many people who are very attracted to the Global Ecovillage Network, the promise of community, might also be people who have changed their lives a lot, who have been looking for what is true for me, how can I contribute, and might have felt quite lonesome at times on that journey. So I was definitely one of those people feeling quite lonesome at times. So I started looking for community very early on. And there's a story of me, which is a reality when I was younger, of walking up the coast in South Africa on a pilgrimage. And, very strong experience of being out alone in an atmosphere of violence and incredible natural beauty. And in that atmosphere, just finding back to my inner courage, but also to my trust in life. And at the end of that journey, ending up in Port St. John's, where a community of people was living together, Black and white people. And that was a changing point, a complete turning point in my life, because I went on that journey from a deep place of not knowing what to do anymore. I had studied cultural anthropology and linguistics. I had been a political activist, so science, activism, and none of it really hit the point for me. And the moment I was in this community, I started being incredibly awake and curious. And it was as if I had found something, but I couldn't quite name it. And it took me years to name it, that it's about believing that we can create the dream of the future now if we do it together. And we need each other, that we cannot do it alone. And that was a deep truth that I somehow soaked up more through my cells and my senses than my brain. And it took me a long time before I could bring words to it. But from that experience, also this concept of not fighting the existing structures, but actually creating the new structures within. If we speak about nested complexity, what happens to complex systems when we bring in a completely new impulse? right? And how can we change complex systems through that? So moving from that back to Europe, I started exploring this network of, through the less traveled paths of mouth to mouth inspiration, and just found communities everywhere, in the Pyrenees, in Israel, in India, in Egypt even, it was just wherever I traveled, the world was full of new communities sprouting up, people creating these lifestyles, but also in a very, very hidden way. And I decided quite early on that I wanted to live in communities. So in 1995, when the GEN conference happened, I was actually just moving into pregnancy with my son. And I knew about this conference happening. So my friends from the community, at that point I was staying in Germany, and my friends, Silke and Dieter Halbach, Silke Hackmeyer, who've been very close. They were co-founders of Sieben Linden, but also co-founders of the German Ecovillage movement at that time. They both came. So they shared the stories about, even at that time, that there were only 3 people from Africa present at that founding conference. And when it was called a global network, they stood up and said, what about us? Our voice isn't really here. How can you call this global? So I was really aware, and I went to some of the earliest gatherings of GEN. In 1997, I believe, or 1998, there was a gathering in a German community of the European part of the network. And I found it exciting, but also it was very small. At that time, the gathering was like 30 people. The European gathering was 30 people or 40 people coming together. And it grew, my engagement really deepened through moving to a bigger eco-village in Germany, getting involved in the founding of Gaia Education, the writing of the curriculum. But then my real entrance came in a very surprising moment, which was 2008, when I had co-created, co-hosted actually with Francois Wiesmann and Thomas Hübel, a big conference in Berlin on the topic of the power of collective wisdom, which had many people from communities in Europe come to that conference. And afterwards, I went back to my home eco-village, Sieben Linden, and there was a European gathering of the European network. At that point, around 70 participants.
This was in 98, you said?
2008.
2008, okay.
Yeah, 2008. And at that gathering, I spoke out. I was verbally outspoken about the fact that still the African networks and the Middle Eastern networks were kind of folded into the name of GEN Europe, Africa and Middle East. Mm-hmm. But that the funds that came from Gaia Trust were staying within Europe, right? Because that was the only network that was functioning. And I ended up being elected as president of GEN Europe at that gathering, which was a complete surprise to me, and I'm sure to many others. But it just opened this door into an activation from being a trainer, a consultant for community creation, to suddenly bring to the table my master's also in organizational development, which, yeah, and from...
And that just briefly, because that was after you'd already really built up a very strong series of Ecovillage Design Education programs in Sieben Linden with the German government, and had also brought people from Africa. Did that happen afterwards?
No, that had happened before.
Okay.
The first course, I think, was 2006 or 2007. I think 2006. And my love for Africa naturally runs so deep. So I had always had this, also just for, my sensitivity around privilege, the deep quandary around privilege that has been a part of my life story. And I think it's at the heart of the deepest trauma that is currently ripping the world apart, currently in the US, but in so many places. is the story of privilege and the unintegrated trauma of the past that we carry that keeps recreating inequity in our world in deeper and deeper ways. But so my engagement with Gaia Education and bringing out the Ecovillage Design Education, super passionate about this, spreading the knowledge of how to create community, how to regenerate ecosystems, how to regenerate cultures, how to regenerate economic systems, and teach that in depth was a part of my life already at that time. And I'd also just happened to be at the board meeting, the International Gen board meeting in 2007. I ended up facilitating that with Ina Meyer-Stoll from ZEG in Thailand. So I was clued into Gen for a while before.
Very briefly, I had some beautiful conversations of the two of us at that meeting. Would you be okay if I shared them?
Yeah, I'd love to see them.
They're really historical documents, also conversations with Ina and with everybody who was in Bongsanit Ashram back then. I just thought that it would be quite interesting to tell a little bit more about that time that led up to you being elected, because I always felt from the distance at the time I was at Findhorn that what you were doing in Sieben Linden was really fascinating by really pioneering a path to connection with the German government and international development aid to get people to have them, I think it was match fund some places on the EDE. Or how did it exactly work?
Well, I think it was a gift that was brought to me. So I was in this eco-village in Germany, Sieben Linden, which was based on a foundation of radical ecological simplicity. So based on the Club of Rome report, Limits to Growth, and wanting to bring down the ecological footprint to 30 and even 10% of German average. And I was living in the most radical neighborhoods. So the eco-village is now around 150, 170 people, but organized in neighborhoods. And the most radical neighborhood at that time was called the Club 99. So we were living in an area where we just trialed building a house without any electricity, just with horsepower and only with materials from the immediate vicinity. So the wood, sawing it through with old German saws, hand saws. My little son was helping to trample the mud for the walls. And we ended up with a house that was below 10% of the energy resources that a house uses in Germany of a similar size. But also we lived in an area where nothing that was wrapped in plastic was allowed to be brought in. Nothing that had been wrapped in plastic. So nothing beyond local production. We ate locally, and I lived that life for 4 to 5 years. I love to do things in cycles and really get a deep taste of it. I didn't fly for 7 years. I refused to fly. So I remember traveling by train up to Findhorn and,
This is really fascinating because we both did the no-fly thing for about 7 years at a time where very few people did it, and then got a lot of stick afterwards when it got fashionable. Yes. We decided to fly for other reasons.
That's right. That's right. So, I always had a global heart, I think, I just carried it within me, having been born and grown up in South Africa, lived in different countries. And I think I am an African, my body is African, even though I have a white skin. I connect to the nature deep in the soil, to the animals, to the plants, to the sounds in the air. Like South Africa is my physical home in the world. There's no question about that, So I just carry this love and heart for Africa especially, but coming from Africa for the world. And I was fascinated whenever we had the chance of inviting global friends to come and visit. That was where my heart was beating. And I became fascinated by the fact that we were, for instance, using draught animals in Sieben Linden, horses. My best friend was this horse whisperer, Silke. And we had people coming to us from, say, Colombia or Venezuela or Ghana or India, who were saying, oh, we're just getting rid of our draught animals, you know, and we're just replacing them with tractors. And we were saying, well, actually, you know how this will stamp down the soil. And here in Germany, we're just reintroducing draught animals in some of the farms, because in terms of sequestering carbon in the soil and non-till soil, you know, it can be wonderful to work with animals in that way. So, you know, we had people coming saying, what, you build your houses with straw and mud and you're proud of it? You know, you've just been to our countries teaching us to use cement, you know, now we come here and you're proud of this, you know, you're proud that you grow 80% of your own vegetables, you know, shall I laugh or cry? You know, this was the kind of responses we were getting, and I just loved it.
Yeah.
You know, I loved it.
We talked about this before. I had a kind of similar key experience teaching the first EDE in Wongsanit after that meeting that we just talked about. And having somebody who was a village leader from I think a Christian group in the north of Myanmar. And after giving a talk on, here are images from ecovillages all around the world, showing some of the flagships and some of the smaller ones, and kind of talking about the patterns and John Gilman's first report and all those kind of things. He came up to me after the talk with a sort of slight sort of hesitation in his voice, and was like, if what you just showed me were ecovillages, then all our villages are ecovillages.
Yeah.
And I said, yes. And this
exactly.
and this moment of recognition, north-south, that so much of what the North has thrown out, baby, with the bathwater of patterns that root you in landscape, that root you to your health through food, that root you to your ecosystem, that make you indigenous to place and inhabit place, are patterns that we're now desperately seeking to reinvent, recover, reconnect with in the global North, and giving just that function that Jen has had of encouraging people in the global South to say these patterns are valuable patterns, and don't make the mistake of, just because the media pretend you all have to look like a Californian, you don't, and you can have.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So that's the you know, that's the exploration that I got so involved in. So, you know, just from that inspiration, I started inviting people from the global South as much as possible to come to the course. And the connection to the German Foreign Ministry actually grew out of that.
Yeah.
So I started just by using my own funds and collecting private donations from friends, you know. I really wasn't a fundraiser, but I learned to be a fundraiser over the years.
There's also a lesson in there, because you created a pattern that you could then point to when you asked for the funds.
Exactly, that's what I was just going to say. So in 2009, I went to COP15 in Copenhagen, which was the disaster COP, as some people called it, where all negotiations broke down. And, you know, one friend who stayed a close friend of mine over all these years, who was there to negotiate as part of the German delegation, he had been to one of our presentations, to a few of our presentations. And I started conversations with him afterwards, because he was so deeply disappointed that he said, we need to start doing something different. And this is the other pattern that is very important, that there are good people everywhere.
Exactly.
Amazing. We spread ourselves, you know, I wouldn't say thinly, but we are everywhere. So the people of Regeneration are not just in Gen and the permaculture movement. They sit in governments, they sit in corporations, and we just need to seek each other out. Because I would say, you know, even going deeper than that, it's not the people, but the places in people that beat for regeneration. I would say those places are alive in every person. And we just need to connect to them and bring them out. And it's the most joyful creative, heart-fulfilling impulse to give to life. It's the act that brings joy and satisfaction and fulfillment to our lives, that brings out our potential in life. So, you know, this is what we can give to each other, what the movement of regeneration gives. But I want to come back to my story, sorry. So, you know, I could already share images also from people in the Global South connecting to a German eco-village, teaching us. You know, we had this amazing indigenous woman, for instance, from Orissa, come to the Ecovillage in Germany. In the introductory round, everybody says where they are from. She shares, I am from the forest. I come from the soil, and I will return to the soil. My name is the name of a bird species who lives in our forest, because these are the beings that I am most closely family with, you know? And then, you know, she was shy because she couldn't write as well. Her English wasn't well. She had never been to official schooling. But she knew how to make 40 kinds of compost from cow manure, how to make herbicides from cow urine. She could recognize more herbs and teach us about their health qualities than we could, you know? So the deep touchedness of really touching into the depth of indigenous knowledge systems, you know. And still, I just want to say one more sentence. When we speak about ecosystem restoration, when we speak about indigenous wisdom as referring to the ecosystems, we are only touching the surface. And we need to realize that the deep connectedness that lies at the heart of indigenous wisdom, or at the heart of belonging to the planet, goes far beyond ecosystem restoration.
Absolutely. I in a conversation with John Fullerton a couple of months ago, somehow the simplicity of the framing, that where we went wrong was when we stopped understanding that we belong to the earth and started believing that the earth could possibly belong to us.
Yeah.
And that is really at the heart of all indigenous wisdom cultures. But it isn't just an intellectual thought. It is a complete other way of being. When you feel yourself as an expression of landscape, like you were just describing this woman expressing her relations. I think it's...
Yeah, and maybe even to state it quite a little bit differently, I am an expression of landscape, yes, and my nervous system is part of the planet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And beyond planet even.
And beyond planet, exactly. Yeah, so I'm wondering, you know, because I also see time flying, I'm wondering how to tell, you know, a little history of Jen in a short time. But
there's one thing that I wanted to briefly get back to, because on the one hand, it is interesting that in this founding moment at Findhorn, at that conference, there wasn't enough representation of the Global South. But to be fair to the emergence of that moment, the conference wasn't called to create Gen. The conference brought a bunch of people together that then decided, now that we're all together, we should create Gen. Like it was kind of almost a rushed, like the way I've always had it told from the Musketeers that were there, Declan Kennedy and Albert Bates and Max Lindiger, and that it was sort of 2 days into the conference that they decided, can we draw up the founding impulse for the Global Ecovillage Network?
yeah, I mean, it was called the Ecovillage Conference, right?
Sustainable communities for the 21st century.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, something
but
like that.
Ecovillage was very core to it. But also, I think we're not speaking here about criticizing that first conference. Much more, we're speaking about, you know, a founding seed and how the patterns of an emerging network are visible in the founding seed, right? And Gen was founded by a circle of white Western people, and even more so white Western men, There were women involved, but the more visible circle of leadership at the beginning was white Western men. And I think that is also honest to own that.
Yeah.
And part of the, part of the transformation that I was a part of, I was the first female president of GEN. I was the first female CEO of GEN. Not the first female president of GEN Europe, but of the Global Ecovillage Network, or the president meaning chair of trustees. But there was a shift also to somehow from a circle of wonderful men. This is Albert Bates, Max Lendegger, and Declan Kennedy, wonderful men, Ross Jackson and Hildur Jackson in the background. And then there was May East stepping up in Gaia Education, and then myself stepping up in GEN. And I've been in very visible leadership in GEN for the past 12 years in varying roles, but very visible. And it's interesting that at this point in time, both May East and I are stepping out, and I hope that more collaborative leadership models are also being developed in both organizations. But so that was one journey, which we could speak more about. But the other journey in GEN has been from, and again, we had Global South represented, for instance, through Sarvodaya, which was a strong founding member and was very present, where traditional villages were honored from the outstart in GEN as ecovillages. Yeah. But there was a time in especially 2008 to 2012 where that was a part of my main work in GEN, was to find a framework of recognition both for traditional villages as ecovillages and intentional communities as ecovillages, urban communities as ecovillages and rural communities as ecovillages. So that, but especially the traditional communities, to bring those voices in, to honor them, because one thing is to know that they're there, another thing is to bring their voice to the table and to bring the learning to the table.
I mean, you really supported the whole, what then led to the foundation of GEN Africa, instead of having that strange, putting Europe and Africa into one secretariat. And also like the support of the GEN activities in Africa really brought all these stories of the Senegal network. And I mean, it's amazing what GEN has catalyzed by linking local people's good work, not by coming in and doing the work, but by enabling and linking and supporting people in Africa to work together.
Yeah, so when I was invited in 2008, I was explicitly invited in with my passion to work towards the emergence of GEN Africa. So it was part of, and the interesting thing was that you could say globalization of GEN Europe. I know we speak about glocalization, and I realize, I mean, that is the important thing, is to stay very, very rooted in the local and spreading out. But by inviting the global networks to the European conferences, we grew these conferences from 80, I believe, 70 or 80, the first conference I was at, to 700, 800, 7 years later. So real, beautiful growth of interest, simply. And in parallel, through those Ecovillage Design Educations that we just spoke, through being able to show the first example, we were able to attract professional support for the courses. We were then able to invite more people to come to the Ecovillage Design Education courses from Africa. And because the networks are often already existing, mouth to mouth. Who's the person who's doing most community-led work, regenerative work on the ground in Malawi? Everybody knows, and you can go in through seven portals through our network and the same names will be mentioned, right? So finding those people wasn't so hard, and inviting them, and there was a huge sense of synergy, of resonance, of recognition And then the beautiful moment came first in 2011 with the Arab Spring, where I got a call from the German Foreign Ministry saying, actually, we have 70,000 euro left over, and we know that you're doing some work in Africa. Could you arrange something in North Africa? And I said, yes. And so that was kind of the pre-Gen Africa conference, where we could invite people from Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria, Egypt, Sudan, just to come together in Sekhem. And then 2012, we were able to replicate that conference, but inviting all these people, 80 people from around Africa, 90% of whom had completed an EDE in Sieben Linden. And that was just absolutely mind-blowing. I have never experienced anything like it, where a conference happened where people who didn't know each other had all been steeped in the same knowledge community, and they could recognize the language. And within 5 days, we drafted the vision, the mission, the goals, and it was just an explosion of creativity, the most beautiful. Like Gen Africa, you know, it's grown slowly because Africa is not an easy continent to bridge electronically, especially if you work with grassroots communities. But that founding impulse for Gen Africa was just stunning, a star. So I still think Gen Africa will go very far. Yeah, and at the same time, the Latin American network was founded, Casa Latina, which I've been in conversation with, but you know, they just decided, look, this is it. We're breaking loose from the North American networks, and we're wanting to do our thing in Spanish, because we are Spanish and Portuguese, we're not English. And that became Casa. So
it had a similar dimension to it, which is the power of a very diverse, wide, I mean, you were involved in developing the original EDE curriculum, that holistic map, that mandala of the 4 dimensions, and that process of at least opening the window on so many interrelated aspects, from nonviolent communications to how to write a business plan, to how to create a vision statement, to dragon dreaming, to permaculture, to sewage treatment systems. It just gives people a shared knowledge map and a shared experience that then makes it so much easier to connect and do work together. And I've seen this when I went to Brazil and met so many of the Gaianos in Brazil, to see how they are linked up and down the country and have done lots of diverse things since, but it's so much easier to work together because they have that shared experience. And I think Casa drew on that as well.
And I think to a lesser degree, anybody who has visited an ecovillage, especially one of the more established ecovillages, carries that seed within them. So the amount of change making that has grown out of ecovillages, you know, we now link to 6,090 communities in the world that we can, you know what we have the geographical data, we have the connecting person for all these people, all these communities who are linked to the Global Ecovillage Network as communities that are dedicated to becoming sustainable or being sustainable. All of these communities are churning out change makers. Anybody who comes and visits and leaves again says, this has changed my life. And then the Ecovillage Design Education courses are like a cherry on the cake. You know, if you come to a 4-week course like that, an immersion course, you leave, every single person has told me, I'm forever changed. So it's an incredible change-making movement that is going on.
They're incubators for a whole host of projects that grow up in them and around them, that then create the first patterns for what would an ecosystems restoration camp look like. I mean, the big established ecovillages know that because they've been engaged. Somebody who used the ferment of the ecovillage to launch an organization where there was Trees for Life and Alan Watson Featherstone and Findhorn, or it was all the wonderful work that they've done in Oroville, or so many, or the mangrove regeneration in Senegal. There are just so many experiences that you can then not just talk about, but point to. And that's the transformative aspect of learning in ecovillages, that you also connect to real on the ground projects that have a bit of a track record and can inspire people to say, this is possible. I'm going to do this in my region and in my way with my community, and sensitivity to the place that we're in.
Yes, and every eco-village is an ecosystem restoration settlement. You know, I just remember that there was this scientific research done on biodiversity in the Zeg community in a local city, like it's a small town, like a local external neighborhood, and then a rural area, including forests and everything. And the biodiversity was so much higher within the eco-village, you know. So just to say, every eco-village is an ecosystem restoration community or a village. Yeah, it's.
I would love to ask, because I think we're both in our journeys of, on the one hand, deeply believing in the very local, community-grounded work of trying to live sustainably close to the land. And we also care about how does this pattern spread into the wider society. How do we include everybody, including the millions of people living in dense cities? And in what I'm noticing right now is that there's a big push again. There's almost like a new wave of people waking up to that initial impulse that might have brought you and me close to ecovillages many years ago, which might be a bit more at a certain phase in life. You just want to get together with a group of people you feel akin to and just do the project and build the community. And but it can have that little bit of energy of collapsing into the hyper local, to the point that you lose connection with the global. And I think we both care that pendulum swing doesn't happen so much, that people can find their local grounding place, but that we keep open the global pattern. And how do you see that dynamic of, ultimately we need to all localize in order to shift not just doing patterns, but being patterns deeply in us. And at the same time, we also still need to find ways of maintaining global solidarity, collaboration, knowledge exchange, and connection in order to enable that for everybody around the globe. Where do you see, Jen, if you sort of dream into the highest potential now that you're slowly moving out of a leadership role in Jen, where would you see Jen play a role in maintaining that global dynamic?
Yeah, I would love to just go back to the history and complete that first, and it leads there anyway. So it's a perfect comment to bring in. So you know, with Gen Africa and CASA having emerged, we had finally more of a global voice in Gen, and from the beginning. The Global Ecovillage Network was there as a idea, an organization. At the time I stepped in, it was a pro forma Italian NGO that didn't even have a bank account anymore. So it was really non-existent. And it had an international board that tried to meet in person once a year, going to the most beautiful places around the planet. Very lucky people. That was before my time. And but really the work was done through the three big regions. So Ecovillage Network of the Americas, ENA, and Gen Europe, Middle East and Africa, and Gen NOAA, which was held in Australia. And with the growth of Gen Africa and CASA, with the bringing out of those voices also to the European conferences, which were the biggest gatherings, the biggest conferences, we suddenly had a different presence around the table. It was also much more, Max Lindiger stepped out and we had new people stepping in from Asia, which really brought the Asian voice strongly. So my next piece of work, what I was dedicated to, was also setting up GEN, the global part of the network, as a strong charity. And at that time, I had moved to Findhorn. Findhorn seemed like the perfect place, you know, where the founding of GEN, the celebration of GEN's 10th year anniversary had taken place here. So in 2013, GEN was founded as a Scottish charity. And from that point on, we had a clear constitution outlining that each of the regions would have equal representation to the board, would have equal representation to the General Assembly. And GEN became a real conscious expression of global culture. You know, we have 45 representatives to our General Assembly, and they come from probably 43 different countries. So when we have our General Assemblies, we span the globe and we hear the voices from around the globe. And that is something incredibly precious. And I find, you know, just coming back to my own life, when we speak about, so that's one aspect of globality, is actually listening to the voices. And I see a great struggle around this, or a confusion, I would say, where also I'm often now also in environments where Indigenous voices are there, and it becomes hard sometimes for other voices to be heard, right? Because it's very, it's a huge exploration how to listen and which are the voices that need to be heard at what time, at which time, and how do we allow the world to truly speak to us through human voices, but also through all the other feedback systems of the world. So listening to the world, you know, is super important in GEN and super important in all of our work, of course.
Just a brief question for you personally, because there's a little bit of a parallel, not that I haven't grown up in Africa, but I've also lived in very different cultures. But that ability that, like, you grew up in South Africa, you spend a lot of time in Germany, now you spend a lot of time in the Findhorn and Scottish culture.
And I spent a long time in Holland. I lived for 7 years in Holland, yeah.
Even more. So it's this, having actually lived in lots of different cultural contexts and seeing how there is a different uniqueness, biocultural uniqueness of each place and each culture. How is that informing your work? And do you think it's important for people to have, if they're privileged enough to be able to do so, this multicultural experience?
Yeah, so I feel like we have two topics now on the table. One is about scaling up, and this is another topic. So I just want to park, or scaling out. So I just want to park that one consciously. So, you know, it's lovely you speak to that, because I've been wanting to come to that, you know, also speaking about flying. Because yes, it's been deeply transformative for me to have lived in these different cultural contexts. And, you know, I've to be honest, my sense is that all of us have nervous systems. I just want to say that before I go into the rest, I think that our nervous systems have, and we know this scientifically also, that we have a far greater capacity to receive information from the world around us than we are working with. And at the heart of regeneration, to me, lies the opening of our capacity to receive the information that is necessary to be able to respond adequately. We are not able to respond adequately when our nervous systems are shut down. And our nervous systems are shut down. Not, I mean, that's too absolute, but they're shut down in places. And that's an issue of compassion. What it needs is compassion and healing, because there's a very good reason for our nervous systems not to be open. But to come back to my cultural experience, growing up in South Africa, my nervous system as a child was able to read the field. I grew up in a relatively conservative boerenfamilie, speaking Afrikaans, which is my language, Afrikaans, which believed that apartheid was the only way to keep us safe as a family, as a nation, Afrikaner. And I grew up with a sense of the field, with dreams about the reality of apartheid, with a sense of the growing wave of anger and injustice. I could feel it in every cell of my body as a child. And yes, I did see a few images in my childhood which brought it home so starkly. There was no way as a child in South Africa that I wouldn't have been able to see the system, you know, and there was a heavy, way that the system was portrayed to us as children at school. You know, history started with Van Riebeeck landing in Cape Town. You know, there was a very specific way the history was taught to us, or the reasons why the system was in place. So waking up to that, the injustice being felt on a physical level without a system responding to it adequately, without being allowed to speak about my sensory perceptions, what I experience, I find that same reality is replicated globally to all of us, you know, as our sensory apparatus, our nervous system reads what we are doing to the planet. And I believe that we are much more able to do that than we consciously know. I believe we are doing it much more than we are consciously know. The rising levels of depression are one expression of that, you know, and again, if we align ourselves with what we know is right and wrong, wherever we are, we find our pathway. It's like the red thread, right? So having lived in these different countries was one entrance door. The other entrance door for me came with the flying. And the fact that I've now worked in 48 different countries around the world, most of them in the global south, many, many of them in the global south. And when I've worked, I've mostly worked in communities on the ground. So I've had that experience, you know, I've had the experience of going to the United Nations Climate Change Conference, watching governments speak about stopping the logging down of trees, and then traveling through a country like, say, Ghana or Zambia, and just watching the trucks roll out with the biggest, oldest, most beautiful trees, you know, being in the Gambia, watching the trucks roll out with the sand from the sand dunes, while at the same time the sea levels are rising. And the government knows that these villages are directly threatened by sea level rise, and still the sand is being shipped out to the rest of the world. I've been watching the waste from Europe being brought into Africa. You know, all of this is visible on the ground if you travel, and you don't travel to the touristic hotels, but you actually travel the countries, you travel the world. There, you know, I can see the destruction of our ecosystems as we speak about ecosystem restoration. And I feel like maybe I've just come to a time in my life where I've seen it. I have felt it. I've come home time after time after time, bringing hope to these places, supporting the growth of regenerative communities on the ground, and come home with a breaking heart and a need to mourn deeply for what is happening to our planet. And I feel like somehow this lockdown and the coronavirus, it's just You know, the timing is so exquisite. I interviewed my good friend Bisulela Namises, one of the elders from Namibia, in January for the Communities for Future Summit, the Global Ecovillage Network Summit, where she said, we just need everything to stop. All the machines, all the airplanes, everything needs to stop just for a moment so we can breathe in, so we can actually come back to the land and think, what on earth are we doing? And then coronavirus came. You know, some people, I wouldn't say it's her doing, but I do think that some people have been tapping into the need for a time of reflection, you know, the need for a kind of a bit of a shock treatment to, you know, I would say the opposite of a shock treatment, because the slowing down has allowed our nervous systems also to slow down. And I know that it's going in many different directions. But for me personally, I feel that I have gathered an incredible amount of information. I couldn't be more grateful for the love relationships that I have built across the globe, the beauty of the people that I have met in these networks, you know, because this is about love. And it's not an abstract love. It's my love for Linda Kabera in Zimbabwe. It's my love for Sunita from Cameroon. It's my love for Mugova, for Paul from Ghana. It's my love for Jennifer from Colombia, for Margarita and Evan from the islands in Colombia, you know. It's the love for the people in Sri Lanka or Thailand, or, you know, it's our love for each other that matters. And there's something where we can build that love through Zoom. We can deepen that love through Zoom, but we're just learning to do that. We're just learning to actually open a true being of nervous systems together through Zoom. And it's still easier for us to do it in human to human connectedness. So we're learning now, right? But that love is the basis for true humanity to emerge. So I could not be more grateful to KLM, to the possibility to travel. And I think it's really hard if you live in one place all your life to grasp the global reality. We have an incredible resource brought to us, though, which is the refugees traveling the world. And they are doorways, right? They bring the world to our doorstep. What a gift. So sitting with each other, and not just touching the surface, but going truly deep, eating each other's food, listening to the cultural stories, listening to the true pain, watching the images, the photographs, the history of the countries, you know, this is what will bring us home to ourselves. So I believe this is super necessary. And maybe I can go to the scaling out and scaling up, or
it's just such beautiful.
Oh, we're at the end of our time.
What you've just said is really a wonderful place to end, but at the same time, there's so much more we could talk about. I just would like to link into your next steps from that, because you've shared beautifully your passion for Jen and the people that is, because Jen is just a name, but it's the people that you were able to connect with all around the world that hold that impulse and spread it. But you've for so long also drawn very strongly from your work with Thomas Huber, and I understand your next step with the Pocket Project brings you also closer to working with him even more. And what you just spoke to, there's on the one hand is this central reconnecting to our ability to be empathic and loving to our wider family and to life. And I have always admired that for a long time you've been, through Thomas's work, working with those blocks that shut off our nervous system, so the trauma work and the deeper work of patterns. And I understand that Pocket Project also tries to work with that. Can you say a little bit more about your personal next step before we finish?
Yeah, you know, I think that just in the Global Ecovillage Network, I have also been in that tension of the local and the global, where my tendency was always very much to go out there to say, look, we need to give Jen to the world. We need to open up to the globe. You know, that's been mine. And there is another part in Jen, which is very much about the local. And I love my garden, you know. It's not the content of my work in the world, but I completely love my carrots growing and my beans and my cucumbers at the moment. So that, but that tension between giving enough space for the localization impulse and the opening impulse, the going out, and how to really bring those together. That's part of the shift that I'm making. And the other part of the shift is just seeing again and again how in our movement of regeneration, we hit ceilings. So we give everything and we do amazing work in ecosystem restoration camps, in ecovillages, but we hit ceilings in the social, and I've watched this over time. So I've watched communities develop really beautifully to a certain level, and then it feels like they start circling. And I've been wondering about this, and the next level of creativity is on the edge of those communities. I've really been wondering about that, and I've written a book on collective wisdom in Germany, exploring what is collective wisdom. At that time, I asked the question, and what is collective stupidity? Now I would ask, how is collective wisdom linked to collective and intergenerational trauma? And as you say, for me, the edges of our regeneration movement are where we hit the places in our nervous system that are not open to receiving feedback, that are not open to be inspired by an intelligence that is bigger than us. And I would say the deepest wound that we carry is believing that this sack of skin is who I am. And we know that we're more, but I don't think we have an idea of just what interdependence actually means, what the web of life that we are woven into, that we are not on top of, we are a deep expression of it, and we will indeed go back to it. Yeah, what that means. And so now I feel like it's about, you could say, the job of cleaning the pipes so that the energy of inspiration and creativity can run more freely through the nervous system of humanity. I believe deeply that we are here on the planet as guardians of life, that we are here to express our beauty in extremely unique ways, where each individual is a king or a queen of our own unique expression, and at the same time that being a perfect, synchronistic, unique contribution to the whole. And if each one of us gives our piece to the whole, there's not too much to do for anyone. So the cleanup of our nervous systems, that we need to be able to do that. That's what I'm fascinated by next. And many people get a bit like, oh God, working with collective trauma, that sounds very dark and daunting. To me, it's like, it's the most exciting journey ever. That's where the pearls are waiting to be, that's where the light is waiting to be unveiled, you know? So I'm just super excited.
And it's also the most deeply regenerative work, because it is the regenerative work of understanding that in healing those places in us, you heal the larger, it goes beyond the humanity nature dualism that runs so deep in our culture. It understands that if we truly want to become expressions of life creating conditions conducive to life again, we need to deal with these wounds. And the way you just described this dance of enabling everyone to shine in expressing their full unique potential that only they in the whole history of life on earth and humanity have. There's only been one moment for that person to be that person in the best way possible, and that in doing so in service to the larger, that's where the nourishment comes from, the larger, that enables that individual to do that. So it's this dynamic tension that life has and of living in this illusion of consciousness of being for oneself, and being part of a larger whole, that I find is where the conscious evolutionary participation in this process is what we're stepping into when we're talking about true regeneration. So I'm super excited that you. I really honor you for what you've already seeded in the world, and I feel that special period before you moved to Findhorn that we spoke about a little bit, where these EDEs were happening from Sieben Linden. I know that I've met lots of people that were deeply touched by what you enabled with those courses. We haven't had much time to talk about how, like, Paolo and the Lush connection, and also weaving in a visionary company into supporting this kind of work. So we talked about bringing in the German government, but you're an arch weaver, and I see you, and I'm inspired by you. And we could go on for a lot longer, but this has been beautiful, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Daniel. A real joy speaking to you. Yeah, and I look forward to, in an interesting way, connecting to more people through this video when it goes out. So interesting, right? How we connect to so many people. The uniqueness and the global family. It's beautiful.
For me, this is my little way of trying to find a rhythm with actually going local, local.
Yeah.
Like, I feel a very strong clarity now that my daughter is very young still, and I've got 3 years before she legally has to go to school. Whether we do homeschooling or not is another question that is open. But I really want to spend the next 3 years deepening my roots here and spending time with my daughter, planting trees and building a home. And so I'm a little bit in this tension of how do I do that without, like, how do I disconnect a little bit from that amazing work that is out there that can be done weaving networks and people together, and just coming home to re-nourish and just go through that cycle in the trust that there'll be times to be more globally focused again for me. But right now I feel a strong need to come home to the soil.
And I think the same might happen for me. It just feels like, wow, this is the shift. I'm going to, after being away for more than 50% of my time for the past 10, 15 years, I'm going to be staying home and connecting globally. Thank you, Daniel. Go well. All the best. Much love.